let's start sewing the 9802 teddy. We are going to sew the teddy, then we'll sew the robe. The first step is a very simple step, but you could easily mess it up because we are sewing the lace panel to the front along, let's call this a diagonal bodice seam, whatever you want to call it, with the straight stitch back to the beginning and the end. Couldn't get any simpler. But what you could easily do is flip this over and sew the armhole edge to the front and the center front edge to the armhole. Easiest way to not mess this up is that when you lay these pieces out, this will be a continuous line. So the center front edge is a curved diagonal edge, whereas the armhole isn't. And if you lay it out, it kind of is it becomes one line. Whereas if you put it on this side, that doesn't make sense. One of the tailors I used to work for said one of the best sewing skills that you could have is common sense. Does this make sense? No. So let's use our common sense. Let's sew it so that it looks straight, diagonal seam, and then move on to the next step. So I have attached the lace panel to the front along the diagonal seam. If you have a serger, you can serge it. If you don't have a serger and you're using a fabric that won't fray, you can leave the edges raw. If you're using a fabric that does fray, you can press the seam allowances down and then do a little top stitch like I did, a little zigzag stitch, so that the seam allowances don't show through this sheer lace. You can use a straight stitch. I use a zigzag stitch because the rest of the stitches that I'll be using on the fold over that are visible are going to be zigzag. So it's my little sewing kind of peculiarity, if you want to say, is that I like the stitches to match all over when I can. Next step is that we are going to sew the fronts together along the vertical seam, center front seam. The reason why we attached the lace panels first and then attached the fronts together instead of doing the front panels together, doing the fronts together, and then sewing them together is because if you attach this, trying to attach this to this on this angle would be really hard. It's a lot easier to attach the lace panels to the fronts and then just sew a straight stitch rather than trying to sew this curve right here, this angle right here. So we're going to use a straight stitch, right sides together. You just want to make sure that this point at the center front matches. So what you can do, a little tip, is that pin it right here so that it's super exact. Do a little straight stitch to tack it down. Then go back and sew the entire seam. Center front seam is sewn. I use a straight stitch. I serged this portion of it, but on the lace portion, when I was serging, I swerved off, and then for this portion, I just pushed the seam allowances to one side and did a straight stitch top stitch to secure it down. Doing a serge on this portion of delicate lace just gets a little funky, and sometimes your serger can have an attitude and just not cooperate. So I swerved off, and then I just did a regular straight stitch to top stitch the seam allowances this way. Next step is to sew the front to the back on the side seam. Another simple step that could easily be confused because the edges, one edge looks like another. What's the back neckline? What's the side seam? So here is a picture that shows what the side seam is and the angle of the back. So if your picture or if your garment does not look like this, then you got some issues and you need to repin and figure out which way the back panel goes. Okay, so now we are going to sew fold over elastic, which is this trim right here, to the outer edge of the bottom ruffle, as well as the back neckline / underarm that becomes the front neckline. If you've never sewn fold over elastic, I'm going to give you a little tutorial on it for the 9802. It applies to most bra making projects, but if you want to learn more about sewing fold over elastic, sewing elastic, bra making, I suggest checking out our YouTube page as well as our virtual classes. So, a couple things to note about fold over elastic is that you can see here, even in black, you can see that there is an indentation down the center of the elastic. And that's where the name comes from, because you fold it along that line, and that's why it's called fold over elastic. On most fold over elastics, there is a right and a wrong side. If you're purchasing fold over elastic from Madalynne, you can see that there is a matte side, which will be sewing for the first step, and then we flip it over and we'll sew on the shiny side. Your elastic might be a little bit different. So you are going to start with the wrong side face up, and you are going to lay it down, and you are going to put the matte side so that it is on this side of the fabric. You're going to use a zigzag stitch, and I know your first question is going to be, well, what's the width, what's the length, what are your settings? It's going to vary from machine to machine. I wish that the sewing gods and machines would all collaborate and do a partnership and have all of their zigzag stitches across all sewing machine vendors be consistent, but you know what? It's not a perfect world. So I suggest looking at some of your ready-made lingerie, looking at those zigzag stitches and kind of comparing and contrasting, and saying, does mine look like this? Are my zigzag stitches too close together? If your zigzag stitches are too close together, you'll get a lot of buckling and waviness. So that is a sign that your zigzag stitches are too close together. Generally speaking, you want the width of your zigzag stitches to be about half the width of your elastic. So from that indentation to the edge of the fold over. So I'm going to sew with a zigzag. Next question I always get, how much tension should I apply to fold over elastic or to any elastic in general? Generally speaking, you only add a slight bit of tension because the act of sewing it stretches it out. So you are adding a slight bit of tension to compensate for that. You don't want to add shearing, but in certain cases, you want to add shearing for decorative effect, but in 99% of the cases, you don't want there to be any shearing. Fold over elastic is sewn in 2 steps, so we are going to sew the first pass, and then we're going to flip it over to the right side and sew the second pass. So by pass, I just mean step. It's sewn in 2 steps. That's all that word means. So I'm going to do a little demo, and then I will show you the after. So if you see here, I will give it a little tug, just a tiny tug. Now, as I'm stitching, I'm making sure that my needle right here is hitting super close to that outer edge of the fold over elastic. Okay, so I've sewn my first pass, and even though I use black on black, I'm pretty sure you can see this. Yeah, that the stitches are really, the zigzag stitches are really close to that outer edge of the fold over elastic. You can see it on this side. There's no buckling. It's laying pretty nice and flat. So then the next step is to sew the second pass, and all you do is that you fold it to the right side and you fold it over and you sew it with the same zigzag stitch settings. And if you applied any tension, then you will want to stretch it or apply the same amount of tension on the second pass as well. the second pass, and you can see that the zigzag stitches are really close to that outer edge. There's no lip on it. So you will want to do this the other ruffle outer edge as well as the back / front underarm. I will show a picture that will show you what it should look like, the pattern pieces, after this step.